is a more what you would say collaborative effort to remedy situations and not necessarily attack someone for the breach. And I know that we hear about these huge fines, but these huge fines come after what is mandated in the GPR to go to report and to go through a process, give them 30 days. And there's a process in which we communicate. And I definitely want to piggyback off of what Samantha said, because half of this is communicating that breach to the public relations department to allow them to have a full understanding of what really happened and what it really means to lose your data, whether it be personal information or sensitive health data, or your COVID status, or when you're visiting the island, your movements. I think those are some of the things that I think about as a traveler. I mean, not so much the COVID test, because I would want to know that you know I'm getting on a plane and we're COVID free within at least 3 or 4 days, margin of error. So that that's the risk that you take when you travel. But um yeah, but that's just my kind of little synopsis about what's going on now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sheree. Great to have you.
Thank you for
So
being here.
I'm moving a little bit further offshore, but close to home. Gonna ask Tracy to just say his greetings. And I think, is that Trinidad in the background there, Tracy?
Yes, it is. It's one of our famous beaches, Maracas Beach. Thank you for having me. So I'm Tracy Hackshaw. I'm a ICT and digital economy strategist. I've done a lot of work in over the last 20, 25 years in this space. I guess my major claim to fame was I did play the role of national CIO for Trinidad and Tobago for about 3 years in the mid 2010s, 2013 to 2016. I've also done a lot of work with the United Nations in the digital economy space and with an organization called ICANN, who some of you may be aware of. They essentially manage and operate the domain name system, the DNS, where we discuss and deal with really technical issues that relate to the internet, including issues that affect cybersecurity. Dealing directly with the question that you've posed, Stacey, so bringing it closer to home, I would like to point out that I'm going to put something in the chat, a couple of links that I think might be useful. Just late last year, we've had quite a rise, especially during the COVID period, of ransomware. And in one of those particular breaches, the second link I posted there is for a regional organization called Ansa Macal. They are a very large conglomerate. They're an association of multiple companies across the region. And they were affected um, third quarter to late last year by a ransomware attack where attackers, this is a pretty stunning attack where they held data for ransom, for well, usual Bitcoin payments. They tried to keep this uh, breach and attack under wraps for some time. And when the media got hold of it, there was some, challenges with dealing with the issue, I guess, in a straightforward way. And I think that leads to what our colleagues, Samantha and Sheree, have just pointed out in terms of how do you deal with the breaches. You have to expect and anticipate that you will be attacked in some way. I think that's not going to go away. The challenge is how you deal with the breaches, how you deal with the attack. So from the standpoint of dealing with the attack in the first place, whether you're being proactive or reactive, as an example there, I put the Trinidad and Tobago CSIRT warning post the attacks about the rise in ransomware attacks, which is one way of dealing with it. If you have a cert in your organization or a cert in your country, they could be very helpful in getting this message out there. But more specifically, what happens after you've been attacked and how you deal with that issue in terms of building trust with your stakeholders, not just your customers, your employees, um, the general public, because once this issue emerges and hits the media, um, there's a breakdown in trust, especially at a time, I think, where we've gotten a lot more take up of the digital economy. Online business has, in the Caribbean, was somewhat behind the curve before the pandemic and has gotten a huge, well, fortunate or unfortunate boost from the pandemic. And building that trust and doing transactions online is something that is very important for us in the region to ensure that the gains that we have made do not fall apart by these types of issues. So it's very challenging, I think, for private sector organizations and governments, both public and private sector, to really deal with these issues and try to find a healthy balance between, trying to, I guess, your reputation being, um, maligned in some way by having these attacks happen. So on the other hand, a lot of people, especially I think within the community of people who understand what's going on, respect the fact that you are honest and upfront with what's happening with breaches. And as I think I'm not sure if we've mentioned this yet, but that GDPR word is going to come up, I'm sure, a few times as these international data protection regulations get more sophisticated and more punitive. Not reporting breaches or not dealing with them adequately is going to not only be a reputational issue, but will be a financial issue. So if you're dealing with customers in the European Union, if you have some business presence there in some way, or if in some way that is affecting the economy, you could be very much liable for a data breach that happens on your shores to a large extent, and because data is effectively borderless, in this new dispensation. We can't say it's happening in Trinidad and Tobago, in Jamaica, in wherever it's happening, because you are affecting other nationalities, other countries, other people. And the JamCOVID issue, I think, is an extremely good example of that. The breach that really happened may have affected a larger majority of people outside of Jamaica than within Jamaica. And I think that's very important. I'm gonna stop there and allow my other colleagues to jump in here. Thanks, Stacey.
All right, great. Thank you very much for that, Tracy. And I think it's really great that you also provided a couple of links to just things that may have happened on your side of the world. All right, so I'm gonna now toss it over further to Martin. You are also burning the midnight oil with us.
I am indeed. Thanks for having me. So I'm Martin Carpenter. I live just outside of London. I've been a CIO IT leader for over 20 years. The last 6 or so, I was the UK CIO for United Healthcare in the UK, building healthcare products. So for 4 years for the NHS. And just to give you an idea of scale, one of the products was delivering around 20 million transactions a month of healthcare data. So quite big, meaty stuff. I'm a fellow of the British Computer Society, and also a leading practitioner of the Federation for Informatics Professionals, which is a healthcare certification, and also a certified healthcare CIO. Although I'm not Jamaican, my mum lives in Kingston, and I've got uncles and aunts who live in Kingston, so it's very much part of my heritage. So I'm very pleased to be able to make a contribution to this conversation today. What I would say is, just in general terms, watching JamCOVID was a bit of deja vu, because in the UK we had a similar experience. We had an initial COVID application which went live, or was supposed to go live, in June 2020, and it was developed in isolation, and it was about this big central database that was harvesting lots of information about people's whereabouts. And the big thing that was really troubling people at that time was around data privacy, and it was some really simple things like, how's my data being captured, how's it going to be used, how's it going to be processed, who's going to have access to my data. And all that's really important because it goes back to what some of the other panelists were saying around data privacy. And in the UK and in Europe, we've had GDPR come in as legislative requirements in 2018. And now you're starting to see that maturity in data privacy being rolled out globally. So in India, rolling out their equivalent of GDPR, in Brazil, rolling out their equivalent of GDPR, in California, rolling out their equivalent of GDPR. So you're starting to see countries that are really taking data privacy quite seriously. I suspect in India, part of it is because there's such a massive amount of business process outsourcing that they would be cutting off a huge chunk of their market if they didn't have some kind of equivalence in data privacy. What that has meant is that there's been a maturing at board level in terms of data privacy and the potential impact that this will have on organisations. So as Tracy was saying, global fine. So let me just put that into context for you, because it's 4% of global revenue, or £17.5 million, whichever is the higher number. So let me repeat that. That's 4% of global revenue, or £17.5 million, whichever is the higher number. So British Airways, a few years ago, had a data breach on 500,000 compromised customers where credit cards were being skimmed for 2 weeks, £183 million fine. Subsequently negotiated down to 20 million, but still a big number. Marriott Hotels, £99 million fine. Again, you know, then subsequently negotiated down lower. Tesco Bank, £16.4 million fine, but again, negotiated down lower. So all of those things go to show that boards are now taking data privacy a lot more seriously than they were before. And I think this is about how economies are maturing in general and starting to view, actually, we need to take this seriously because it's a reputational risk to our organisation and it's a financial risk. But also in the case of India, it's a case of if India Inc. wants to do business with the rest of the world in some of its chosen markets, it will need to mature. So I think there's lots of stuff that's happened with JamCOVID, which you can kind of replay, as Samantha said before, that is a bit of deja vu. It's all about, you know, these things will happen. It's how you respond and how you recover, and having some maturity in that process, as well as being open and transparent, because it's about trying to build back trust of the population, of the citizens, in that actually you're doing something and people are processing your data in a lawful and a transparent way, which complies with most mature privacy policies.
No, that's really good. You guys are making some really great points and kind of highlighting, as you said, the maturity, right? And I don't know, maybe if there is a maturity curve, so to speak, for if one has been developed as yet. That's something one of y'all experts could do, a maturity curve for you know, how governments or economies are, you know, in terms of their current state of play in the space. That would be really interesting to kind of see, and possibly something that's going to be, you know, created a requirement for where are you on that curve as it relates to privacy and security for data that you handle, you know. So thank you very much for that, Martin. I'll toss it over now to Richard. Thank you so much for joining, Richard.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. I'll make a kind of a bit of commentary of my background, and then I'll give you my thoughts here. So I am the chief security architect of probably the largest healthcare company in the world, located in Minnesota. I'm originally from London, but I've been in the US now for 20 years. And I have the pleasure of working for this company that wants to transform healthcare, but obviously in the last year, the world has been dominated with COVID. So I'm going to give you a quick peek into my world as to why I think I can share some thoughts and relevancies in this situation. So as part of this position, as Chief Security Architect, we've supported a number of COVID activities. Some of that is protecting clinical environments from cyber attacks, particularly around the COVID hospitals, the R&D institutions, and being able to protect critical infrastructure. The second part is, due to the pandemic, is enabling advanced technology to enable providers to provide healthcare in extreme conditions. So things like telehealth, enabling technology so that doctors can speak to patients safely using networks and software that we would normally take a long time to validate that is actually secure. Coupled with that, we've been supporting some government activities around processing healthcare information, protecting genomic research, and basically protecting a healthcare environment that typically with healthcare environments aren't as secure as they should, given that they're critical infrastructure. Previous to my role, I've spent a number of years working in the government services industry, working as a Chief Security Architect and Chief Security Officer. And previously, before that, I spent 12 years in the intelligence community doing cryptographic and penetration testing work. So I have a good gambit of experiences, and I'd have to say that what my fellow panel cohorts have said about evolving privacy and privacy being a changing landscape is very much true. And in my position, I work very closely with legal counsel and the privacy folks to make sure that we can bring systems to the market in a safe and secure manner, in a compliant manner as well. But compliance doesn't necessarily equal security. So we have to take a look at what is driving the increase in data breaches. And sometimes we have various different actors launching a very much targeted attack. But in this case around JamCOVID, given the information that I know that is publicly available, I see a very similar challenge that is faced there that I've seen in other healthcare organizations and other countries and other businesses, and that is the emergence of digital cloud that are trying to get to market expeditiously and in using advanced technology. And when we throw all that into the picture and try and serve global customers, you have a perfect recipe for complexity. And where there's extreme complexity, there's a high degree of probability that there's going to be a lack in security in the product. So what I've been seeing is obviously standardization around privacy and getting privacy and contractual obligations in the front of folks. But when you start looking at developing solutions as quickly as we do to respond to COVID and other pandemics, and we use advanced technology and we look to deploy in the cloud, we lose an element of control that we typically would have. And
we've lost you, Richard.
Whether it's Azure, of complexity, you have to have experience to be able to do that. And I see that there's going to be an emergence, if not already, of technology practices around validating applications within the public cloud. And really kind of suggesting, how do we measure whether an application is ready to go live? And there's emerging standards around this. But from my perspective, I'm predominantly focused right now on a number of different technologies. Public cloud is one. I think public cloud has one of the major dangers as we move critical infrastructure to it. And particularly when we use third parties to do that, we really have to understand our obligations and what is actually being delivered. And there's a concept that's been floating around about, and it's called zero trust. In zero trust is really about, break it down from a business perspective. It's not that you don't necessarily trust anyone, but you've got to validate that in various particular components of your agreement, of your solution, you've got to have some verification. And if there's too much trust built into the third party or into the solution, we end up having those security lapses. So that's my perspective on the landscape.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that, Richard. And I think I want to pick up on a couple of the points as we move to the next discussion area, which is really around, JamCOVID. So I've heard that, I heard about it, or, it wasn't a surprise that something like this would happen because it's happening everywhere. I want to essentially kind of toss it back to you guys for a bit more open conversation around, what were your initial thoughts on JamCOVID? Because I think, a lot of persons are obviously concerned about, how this happened. Should we be, holding somebody accountable? There's the whole blame game discussion. We don't want to necessarily get into that. But just, very quickly, what were your thoughts on it? And when we look at how things like this are being handled, which you may have inferred in your discussion, what are some of the regulatory or legislative structures or models or even policies that are in place globally that could influence what we do here, having now had this international breach? And I'll start with you on that, Martin.
I think it comes back to what I was saying before about GDPR. And in the UK, we have a very strong regulator called the Information and Commissioner's Office. So if this had happened in the UK, the first thing that would have done would be to report it as a data breach to the Information Commissioner's Office, and to go through the process of investigation as well as rectification of doing that, in terms of making sure tying the data breach down, just turning systems off, but then making sure that the impact assessment was properly done. So there's something called a data privacy and impact assessment, which needs to happen. So I think there's maturity which needs to happen in terms of the response, both from a regulatory perspective, as well as for those organisations that are involved. And as far as I can tell, there is no regulation at the moment that happens within the Jamaican government in terms of saying data and data privacy is an important area of legislation for us. And we've also got a regulator which has got some clout to make sure that if you do something bad, that something will, there's some restoration that will happen. And therefore, from a company's perspective, at the moment, they're just complying with the law. There's nothing to stop them having a data breach. And there's no guidelines and policies. So I think, it's incumbent on the government really to start playing its part in setting out what those guidelines and the legislation needs to be. And the great thing is that there is some already published legislation in English that can be easily taken from one place to another, because that's exactly what's happening, as I said, in Europe, UK, California, Brazil, India.
Sam?
Yeah, so look, let's not do Jamaica so bad. No, Martin. Jamaica has legislation on the books. It just hasn't been published, approved in full as yet and implemented as yet. Look, and in terms of this incident and how it arose, actually, and I'm putting my lawyer's cap on, I may not have notified the ICO because there was not actually there was a security incident which was highlighted by a sweep, by an ethical hacking, whatever we want to call it, pen testing, whatever we want to call all of that, right? So look, let me lay some foundations here. When I first heard about JamCOVID, because I come from a travel background, I used to be the global privacy officer, chief privacy officer, whatever the title is, for CWT. CWT is a leading business-to-business travel management company. It represents something like 19 million travelers annually. The number of transactions are innumerable. And I was responsible for 150 countries also. It's Minnesota-based, hence why I know Richard's area very well. And it handles the travel for the royal family, near enough every Fortune company I can think of, every FTSE company I can think of, and every company that we've spoken about so far today, they handle their travel. The travel industry is a very complex industry, right? With a complex technology infrastructure. It is reliant upon several interconnected, interdependent transfers in order to complete a single travel transaction, or even you need systems such as this system in the background to support it. So travel is full of breaches, okay? That's the reality. I've been in situations where, because I still support a number of travel clients, I've been in situations where I'm told the FBI has said we need to get on the phone now. We pick up the phone, the FBI, they read the script, and you're thinking, holy moly, what is this? What are we in right now? Chinese.
Just to chime in on that point, though, I don't know that the government called us, Samantha, when this situation happened. So when you think about a CWT, they have some of the bodies that Martin is talking about. I think the issue that we were kind of looking at for ourselves locally is that, where does that happen? Because clearly we're still waiting for the investigation. We're doing a lot of other things, and there's that breach of trust. So I have, even in the chat, I have a very poignant comment from one of the attendees that says, if a government can't manage an app like JamCOVID, right, then how will it roll out a national ID system? Further, that a digital society, that has been the conversation. So we're seeing where, because of that lack of trust, other applications like the ENDS application that is now being rolled out to support the wider community, people aren't signing up. You're not like chasing it down, oh, gimme, because of the same trust factor. So if yes, we can accept that the normalcy is there, but what do we need to put in? Do we need to have a legal group that we're calling that can take on conversations like this and address it? You guys all talked about addressing it. How do we make sure that we have the bodies in place, and what are those bodies to make sure we're addressing it? So I'm going to have you just chime in on that very quickly, Sam, and then I'll toss it to Tracy.
Absolutely. So look, when I first saw the JamCOVID issue, I said, it's time. Every country I'm aware of ends up with a large-scale data breach that makes everybody stand up and say, okay, it's time to pay attention. So I saw that. My thoughts on JamCOVID are slightly complex, and you may have seen that I put out a post on Twitter. The blowback on me was huge when I questioned the motivations of TechCrunch in their reporting on this issue. Because the thing I have never seen before in my entire career, and I discussed this with Digital Jamaica, is I have never seen an ethical, some kind of sweep, which is then published, and then within the same week, they doggedly publish the details of further security flaws that have been highlighted. Because for me, when we look at this, actually, ethical actions can have unintended, unethical consequences. There are bad actors who are lying in wait and have now been alerted to some of these issues. So what would have really happened in other countries? What do I think has happened? I think there has been a complete breakdown in the handling of the incident, purely because the communication And we don't know. I have no clue which lawyers the government has involved. I know a number of very good lawyers, Grace Lindo and other lawyers who are very competent in this area, and perhaps they may have been advising. Okay, so I cannot comment on what took place within the government. What I can say is, when you're notified of an incident, sometimes it takes a while for the information to come through to you. By the time it comes through, what it appears to have happened to me is there has been three main things. One, in the procurement of that system, there was not an adequate vendor assessment carried out. Two, in the development of that system, when we go through dev, and I've worked on lots of dev development, right? There are sometimes little back doors that we forget to close, little dev passwords we're using, you know, the placing of the whole application on a public cloud. To Richard's point, this was done too quickly, just like the UK did it, too quickly for something too important. The UK actually took it back off the market, right? Because it was, they realized what they had done. It was a complete mess at the beginning. The other thing that we now have is that the getting into the communications, the government could have front-ended the communications. They could have come out and said, somebody has identified a situation, a security incident. There's a problem with it. We are looking at it. We've taken it down for the minute. What happened in the JamCOVID situation is what I expected would happen as soon as I saw it. The larger technology publication became the source of truth. And we have no real understanding of what is actually true. We just know what was reported. But in absence of any other communications, that communication vacuum made TechCrunch become that source of truth. So as we look at this, I think, what are my thoughts about the JamCOVID situation? Yeah, I think it is, I don't think it's good. It was well handled, but I, as a privacy practitioner, unfortunately, I expect this because this is part of the maturity curve for any country as it develops its data privacy posture. So those are my thoughts on it. I know we have some questions in the chat, but I don't know when you want to handle those.
Yes, I'm gonna toss to it after I get done with this particular round. Go ahead, Tracy. You had your hand up.
Yeah, so I think there's maybe a private sector bias here in the discussion. So I'm going to put on my government hat for a second and try and
bring on the government hat.
yes, try and be that person. So so I've done work with in previous lives with the regulators in Trinidad and Tobago, and the government, from the central ministry standpoint. And one of the things I would say is that, and I put a link in the chat. I don't know if anybody has seen it. I'm also involved with an organization called the Trinidad and Tobago Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, who has been doing some work on trying to understand Caribbean data protection as a thing, you know, as an area of expertise, especially given what Europe is doing. And when analysis was done of what's happening in the region, it would appear that legislatively there are only two countries, Jamaica and Barbados, that have reasonably up-to-date data protection legislation. The other countries in the region are based primarily on what was known as HIPCA, which was an ITU project in the early 2000s, 2005, around there. I was around in those days, showing my age. And the legislation that is there has stalled in many of the region, the countries in the region, for various, like in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, it's not fully proclaimed because of the need to establish this office of an information commissioner and to do the regulations. So what's happening in countries where the legislation is not, you know, somewhat toothless, or is not fully proclaimed, is that there is no area or bucket where these things can be properly dealt with, and it ends up moving into the media, or ends up moving into some other type of organizational discussion, but nothing tends to happen. So what, as a regulator and a government, what their challenge is when these admittedly challenging things happen to them, and in many cases the expertise may not be within government to solve these problems, they're caught in the headlights. And perhaps there's an opportunity here, and I'll say it, I'm going to make the case for it, for something very similar to what the European Union has done, in that the regional governments and regulators need to get together, look at this, especially given what's happening, as I mentioned in the chat, with the COVID situation, where we're going to have data, we're very likely moving into vaccine passports very shortly. Before that happens, we need to get together as a regulatory regime, as a governmental actor, and try to understand what's going on, try and get our legislative environments, bulletproofed, updated, enhanced, whatever the correct word is, and put the necessary tools and enforcement measures in place so that if and when these things do happen, they can be enforceable. What's happening, I think, now is that most of our legislation is not properly enforceable, and therefore we are allowing, as Samantha just pointed out, lots of things to happen. Vendors coming in who could do what they want, improper assessments being done of applications, lack of knowledge. It just continues, it cascades down from there. So if the regulatory environment and the legislative environment is not fully up to mark, what do you do? And I'm speaking as a government hat person here. I think the private sector and the government do need to get together at this point, work together so that they can help the region move forward with this, as opposed to, we can talk about this, I think, for many weeks, and then it's a 9-day wonder, and we move on, to fixing the roads and fixing our other problems until the next breach happens. So I'd like to advocate here for that sort of working together as a region to get this fixed, both private, public sector, academia, technical community, and to do it as a region so that we don't have problems where something happens in Barbados, and because the region is linked through the private sector, through these conglomerates, it spills over into other countries. The banks are linked. All these things are happening. So that's my take on that in terms of trying to answer that question, Stacey.
Okay, no, great. Thank you for that. And I think just to I'll put it out there if Richard or Sheree have a comment on this particular conversation that we're having. But when you look at the governments that you have interacted with, Tracy, in the Caribbean, do you think that there is an openness or to do this, or do you think it's even somewhere in the headspace to create this collaborative approach based on the number of things that are currently pulling on them, the lack of resources, etc.? Do you feel that this is something that is somewhere in the wheelhouse?
The short answer is no. I think the priority for governments is certainly not technology, certainly not data privacy, certainly not data protection. As a matter of fact, if you were to be totally frank about it, data protection and data privacy is sort of an antithesis to the government thinking. Government is their job is to collect and use that information. So by getting into that data protection and data privacy aspect, it's problematic. But of course, they have no choice because they look out for the public interest. But of course, for the many things that governments have to do, technology and digital things are always, if there's a list of 10 things, it's probably number 9 or number 10, if so high, and far less the intricacies of those issues. So we get a solution, we solve the problem, we solve the issue with the COVID travel, we're solving it with, let's say, vaccine administration that's coming now. But the issue of data and what we do with that data is pushed down in the issue, trying to get something out to deal with the issue first. And that's typical government issue. We'll solve it after if there's a problem. And I think across the board, depending on where in the region the technology ministry is located, and if it's held by a champion or a political heavyweight, it may move up the curve, may move up the list. If it's held by, and this is a real issue, if it's held by someone junior or someone who is not necessarily someone who would be an advocate or be able to go to the cabinet and say these things, then it just waits for something to happen, and then we're firefighting. And it seems in the Jamaica situation that may have been exactly what happened. It seems that Jamaica has a reasonably decent legislative environment, but yet still this happened. I noticed with the NIDS project, there was a whole what we call in Trinidad a bacchanal about the project in, I think it was about 3 years ago, when there was a Supreme Court ruling on the constitutionality of the law that was being put out and what they were doing. Again, if you're not prepared for something like that, then the blowback is amazing. If they fixed it, well, great. If not, you're going to get the same issue, I imagine, happening yet again. And government's not being ready to deal with these very, very precarious issues that move beyond the actual technology. The technology in some cases is easy. In fact, in many cases, it's easy. The issues that relate to the technology, the human issues and the legislative issues are the hard issues. And those are the things that are definitely pushed down the priority list. And if technology is already low, imagine where these are.
Exactly. Thank you for that. And to that point, actually, just to kind of underscore the discussion, we talk a lot about the security aspect, but in our prep meeting yesterday, Richard actually raised a really good point around the consent model for use of people's data. And I just kind of wanted him to just chime in with that, because I feel that even when it comes to JamCOVID and people landing here, you feel like you don't have a choice, right? In terms of handing over, you actually aren't given a choice, you're greeted by soldiers. So what about that consent model that seems to be absent in this entire process?
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, a consent model is really about how an individual is going to adopt technology by embracing it and providing information. I think, Tracy, the focus on what we're going to do with that information is where that consent model parameterizes use, acceptable use. But I just want to kind of step back a second, because everyone is talking a lot about the law and the privacy, and I think those are really essential to drive things top down. But let's just look at the COVID issue here. The vendor failed 3 times on 3 security issues, and an ethical hacker reported it for whatever reason, whatever their motive was. But ultimately, there needs to be a framework in how do we manage incidents, right? Because this may not have been a data breach. We may not know if a breach actually took place, to Samantha's point. So it could have just been a security incident. So I think what is needed is a framework in which we can adopt technology safely and securely, and be able to say, if we do have an issue, if something is reported, what do we need to do? If this is national infrastructure, maybe we need to contain any information being leaked to the press before and then do an investigation. And I think that if you don't have that framework and a consent model as part of that framework, you will find that technology adoption is going to be greatly reduced. And I think if you look around what the healthcare industry is doing with identification and processing really sensitive data, they've identified a need to build and couple consent models where you're collecting really sensitive information. And those consent models have a legal basis, a legal framework that entitles that individual to privacy. So I think consent models are really, really important, but without the necessary foundational framework, it's really difficult to enforce. So that was my perspective.
No, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And good point. Talking about the framework that we can be. We had a discussion in the last webinar about how we can be more proactive as opposed to reactive, which is kind of the way that we see technology needs being approached just now. And I can understand, based on the pressures that government has to deal with, that can be something that happens pretty consistently, but we're at the place now where we need to shift up the maturity curve. And so we can no longer rest on the laurels of React, right? Based on what I'm hearing from everybody else. All right, so I'm gonna just ask us to touch on one particular point that was also raised around procurement, because Samantha actually raised this, and toss it over to Martin to talk about considerations that should be made for procurement of technology vendors on projects that have national implications. Because Richard, you just said it, you know, or you said it earlier, it was, you know, kind of quick, right? And the way that you go about actually engaging vendors, you know, when you're at a business level or when you are at a maybe individual consulting level, I think the implications are low, but when you're dealing with national and international data, what kind of requirements, what kind of procedures do we think we need? What considerations do we need to have in place to handle something like that?
Yeah, well, I think for me, the first thing is it's always at this kind of level, getting the vendor to mark his own homework is a really bad idea. So I think having some framework where you've got acceptance testing and you're doing the penetration testing and you're making sure that the code is secure, you know, back to Samantha's point around backdoors and vulnerabilities, that process should really be done by an independent third party as part of acceptance testing before it goes into live. I think part of it is also looking at a vendor's delivery process as well. So with modern agile delivery processes, you kind of move assurance away from being the far end process of acceptance and more into design. So privacy by design and information security by design need to be embedded within that process and not an afterthought. So those are the two main things that I think as a procurer you should be thinking about is how am I going to make sure that I'm specifying how I am going to accept this, so that when the vendor is building the system, they're building it for the acceptance testing, and that creates a slightly different mindset in terms of software.
And then just to kind of pull on, I see Richard, you've taken off you want to chime in on that one in terms of.
Oh yes, if I can. I think Martin's exactly right. Is when we're doing procurement or vendor evaluation, it really, there are particular privacy and security frameworks out there that you can use to evaluate vendors and evaluate how they build solutions and evaluate the solution as well. And I think some people forget that we may do one or the other, but we need to do both. So that's just kind of an underlying fact I wanted to have with Martin. So thank you.
Right. Okay. Just very quickly, I think I saw Shane's hand up, one of our attendees, but I'm not sure if he had a question. If you could just type it in the chat, please, because we're running up on the top of the hour, and I have a couple more questions that I want to get our panelists to speak on. So please, guys, drop your questions in either in the chat or in the Q&A so that we can get them answered for you. In terms of making sure that, because I know Sheree focuses a lot on education, right? And we didn't necessarily even really speak about this, but what are the considerations that we should be making in educating? And this is something that I don't know how it touches all the different persons that are going through implementation and monitoring and managing, but are we prioritizing educating and ensuring our people that are on the ground, as you said earlier, Sheree, the people that are behind the computer? How do we ensure that we are looking at whether or not they're capable of handling security and privacy? I'm getting your British accent, your privacy issues.
Well, I don't have the British accent, but I can speak to that because awareness training is sometimes, I think it's so complex, and rolling out data privacy awareness training. People think it's such a complex thing. You have to, complete your impact assessment first, and where the gaps are, and what some of those preliminary trainings or baby step trainings could be had on, or is usually implemented on the onset of rolling out privacy protection, even before even reviewing some of what your data privacy policies and procedures are. Even before all of that, we go in and educate what we are really looking for, because we know that we have been dealing with data for a long time. And I agree with my colleagues here on the panel today that data breaches have been happening, and we work better when we collaborate together to find those little fixes, to raise a red flag, to say, okay, you have an issue there. And that's why some of these ethical hackers, I know Tracy alluded to pen testing, and that's why some of them reported. And I saw a really good question in the comments. What role does the media play in in breaches or issues, or even security, and how they portray what a security breach could be versus a maybe just a 300 person name list, random name list came out, depending on the the level of breach, or the risk of the breach. I think the company itself can get out ahead of ahead of the media, work with the media to really use it as an opportunity to either educate the public, educate the public sector, the people that actually serve the government. I think that is a huge portion of data privacy that we often overstep or sidestep, because we do think, okay, yeah, you're supposed to change your password every 60 to 90 days, depending on what sort of information you're keeping, if it's a government issued server or something. Some of those protocols that are there, people don't necessarily do that, although they know in the back of their head. So keeping that front of mind, keeping that system in the forefront, so your work, so the people who actually do the job can have it in front of them to think about it as they go about their job. And also, we touched on privacy by design. Some of those policies can include an automation, or for example, I gave the example of the passwords. An example to correct that would be to every 60 or so days, 60 to 90 days, you have a pop-up window to say you're coming up on 30 days, you need to change your password in 30 days. And that will keep reminding workers who access these sensitive information on these company provided, laptops, or even their personal laptops, if they're accessing their emails or anything like that. They have to keep that constant top of mind, security, level-minded. So I think it starts with, of course,
Simple habit.
top down.
Yeah.
So
Awesome. Thank you for that. So I'm going to just touch on some questions, the questions that were in the Q&A and answers that have been given thus far, before I toss over the last question that we have for the evening. So are governments also subject to GDPR, governments and large companies? So answers from Richard: yes, there are obligations in protecting citizen data, but these can be addressed through laws and compliance of similar tools such as Privacy Shield, though there are a thin line between with three-letter agencies. Samantha said, yes, governments in EU are subject to GDPR. However, the GDPR only applies to data controllers established in the EU or doing business in the EU, which is an important distinction, because I know that question went up quite, that those flares for, is the government going to be sued? Are they going to have, all these different lawsuits coming from potential travelers from the UK whose data may have been exposed? So that's been very helpful. Next question, general approach been like for other governments? So Tracy answered, from where I sit, both the media and public sector have been very complacent with regards to responses to breaches. In very few cases are these breaches taken seriously, in spite of the fact their data breaches can be qualified in monetary terms. I think the emerging issues surrounding vaccine passports, digital IDs are going to shift this thinking. However, I think that accountability, when you start to feel it in your pocket, that's definitely when you can start to see some legislation and some regulatory policies being upheld. Large companies are also subject to GDPR. O'Shane, this was your question. What do you think the government needs to do to regain the trust of the nation? Should they report more about their regulations and compliance with international standard? Should they release software update reports to make individuals feel that the application is holding their data? The application that is holding their data is being continuously improved and tested. A couple of answers from Richard I have. Good question, O'Shane. Provide assurance by a third party that the application is secured. I think we also heard that third party approach suggested by Martin. Take steps to introduce legislation and policies to adopt international standards is another good step forward. However, it is important to show they have learned from the incident. That is the key, is how you manage it after. How do you show that you have learned? You know, how do we even, I mean, I'll take advice from this to put forward to our government to say, these are the things that we have to do to start regaining trust in, you know, in the Jamaican public and even the wider public. Tracy, read my comment on CSIRTs and certs in the public and private sectors, as well as in academia and technical community. Academia conversation is next week, guys, so make sure you come back. Then getting these groups to work more cohesively together and to become more proactive could be the first step, sort of a first type org for Jamaica, moving beyond the legislation and regulations and onto action. I agree with you, Tracy, on that. I too am an action person. I think we do a lot of talk in the Caribbean here, certainly in Jamaica. We love to talk the things. We need to now move from talk to action the things. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna shoot over to my last question that is really just to kind of gauge, you know, how we move forward from here, because guess what happened now? One of the main reasons why this conversation is so important, not just for the national ID system, not just for ends, not just for the vaccination schedule or any other system that is going to be rolled out at a national level. It's important because Jamaica as a whole has international aspirations for its technology sector. I've had so many calls recently with technology vendors, global technology vendors like AWS and Microsoft, etc., that and investors that are looking at Jamaica as a tech hub, right? And because that is actually in the space, JAMPRO has a whole initiative about upskilling our people in the space of technology so that we have exportable technology skills, exportable vendors, technology vendors. And with something like this happening on a global scale, what is going to happen to these aspirations? Right? So as a closing point, I would just like each of my panelists to weigh in on the fact that we have these international aspirations. Just leave us with any lasting considerations that we should be thinking about if we really want to be considered seriously as the technology hub of the Caribbean region. So I'll just kick that off with Sheree so that you can go first quickly, and then we'll move through Samantha, and then we'll toss it to Tracy, we'll have Richard, and then we'll end on Martin. I'll say that again just to help you guys out, but Sheree, just chime in quickly on that last point.
Yeah, so I think for companies, I'm going to mention companies and persons. I think companies shouldn't wait till the commissioner start doling out fines to get the house in order, because the law is created already, and although you don't have any, consequences just yet, getting out in front of it would be the right thing for the government to do to regain trust. The government and companies alike, to regain trust after a breach, because having a breach is not the end of the world. It's not the end of the company or the government. It's just something that they have to rectify, and just to better equip themselves to run more efficiently as they go through the process. And for persons, try to become more conscious about how your data is being spread, what sort of access you give companies to access to your data. I think I want to leave that just nugget with you, just to know, try to learn about how companies share data, how they combine maybe data that you've given here willingly and connect it to another piece of data on the internet and create a whole profile about you and what they do with that profile, because the information and data has become somewhat of a commodity now, and how it's being handled, stored, processed, deleted. It needs to be done in an ethical and well-governed way. And that's just a little bit of nuggets that I want to leave at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sheree. Thank you. Samantha?
Well, look, there's a few things, right? One thing that we didn't really touch upon in this conversation is that it's really important to make a distinction between privacy and security. They are not one and the same. Privacy is a holistic package of rights that individuals have around the ability to control how their data is used. Security applies to a much wider set of information. And what I think is one of the key points, if you have digital aspirations, you need to have that understanding correct and build that in to the system. Privacy and security by design. You need to carry out data protection and security impact assessments throughout the life cycle of any tech development. That's what I do with every client when we're developing any kind of application, large, small, or whatever. The other thing I would say is we need to have incident response procedures in place, well tested in advance. Because every company I've worked with, the first data breach, everybody's in a flap. Every government, everyone's in a flap. But actually, you've got to understand these things will happen. And it's, as we said, how you recover from it that's going to be important, which will allow you to maintain the confidence and trust of individuals, of investors, of large companies, and other governments who are seeking to do business with you. So that's what I think is needed for any region, but in particular Jamaica right now with these digital aspirations. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Tracy.
Yeah, so besides the obvious, and I think people are going to state the obvious, I'm going to try and be a little left field here. So two things I think can happen as next steps. One, it's a pet peeve I have in terms of digital literacy. We need to really improve the levels of digital literacy in our region. And something I've said many, many times, the internet is not social media. And we need to move that thinking, shift that yardstick from there to something else so that people understand what is happening with their data, and the kind of links to what Sheree is saying there. So digital literacy really needs to come in. We have left that alone for too long. We need to fix that. And the second thing, it links to what you had pointed out earlier, Stacey, about the project with JamPro. I did work on a similar project in Trinidad. As a matter of fact, the same project that's already been rolled out in Jamaica. Hopefully they'll learn their lessons from Trinidad and Tobago. The digital skills issue, I think, is extremely important. And in terms of a way forward and trying to be more optimistic and hopeful, building a digital skills base within your country is extremely important. That will help, obviously, with this larger issue that we're dealing with. Not necessarily saying that the group who did it is using Jamaica or not Jamaican talent or whatever the issue is, but I'm linking it to building centers of excellence. So one of the things that a center of excellence will do is provide that, linking back to your point about trust and getting a reputation of Jamaica and the Caribbean territories back, building a center of excellence there. Why not do one for cybersecurity? Why not build a digital skills center of excellence for cybersecurity in the Caribbean, using that same discussion we just had in the chat about using the Caribbean as a launching pad? Can be headquartered in Jamaica, who cares? It's a virtual thing. But building that center of excellence, getting the Caribbean to be known as an area where these skills are resident and are top of the line and are in demand, is, I think, one of the ways that we can go forward in repairing any damage that has been done and certainly in bulletproofing or protecting ourselves or future-proofing ourselves from it happening in the future, because we kill two birds with one stone. One, we have the skills, and two, the reputation in the region is one where we are doing what we are doing better than other parts of the world. That has happened in other countries. We have not been doing it well in the region, and that project in Jamaica, I think, is going to try and do it, but it didn't work extremely well in Trinidad for various reasons, and I hope it is addressed in Jamaica. But again, doing it country by country is not the best way. Doing it as a region is the best way. It's a hard thing to do, but it's the best way to go forward. And I think that's probably a good step forward in terms of taking this discussion beyond talk and beyond the laws and beyond all the things that need to be done anyhow into something that can be future-proofed. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Tracy. And I'm gonna have to link you when things slow down, whenever that happens, about the regional, about the togetherness in the Caribbean, you know, because I know that you're a member of the Trinidad Computer Society, so we'll have to talk offline. All right, Richard.
Yeah, I don't know if I could add any more context than what other folks have said. It's been pretty spot on. I agree with Samantha about having the differentiation between privacy and security. I would just share the one mantra that I have with my team and growing up in security, and that is, don't think about the if, think about the when. We already know that legislation in the US in the financial sector it's one of the most highly regulated industries, yet you've just had the recent Capital One breach. So legislation isn't the silver bullet to this problem. I agree with Tracy that we've got to establish a level of competency with technology and security and cybersecurity, and through that, you can provide a subtleness of saying, we are going to be prepared and we are going to expect security failures, but we're going to be ready to deal with those. And let's face it, the COVID issue, I've seen those issues in many different cloud-based applications. It's very common. It's something that can be easily solved. So it's just about developing that cybersecurity experience and then partnering that with the right legislation and the right privacy models.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And Martin, want to wrap it up for us?
Yeah, so I think, you know, just to summarize or just to highlight, there's this thing about the individual level and have individuals having confidence in the government and the government doing the right thing in protecting data and dealing with individual rights around data from a trust and transparency. And that kind of thing is around information privacy, and having the right regulatory environment and a regulator with teeth. The other side of it, though, is around Jamaica's and the Caribbean's aspirations to be a nearshore partner for the Americas. You know, and it's interesting, 3 months ago, I was talking to someone from Amazon and found that they were holed up in Clarendon, I think it was, and you know, they were talking about a return request. So it was really interesting that Amazon are already building out capability. But for companies to continue to do that, it's about having Jamaica Inc. being the protector of those companies' brands. And in order for that to happen, they need to have some certainty around trusting customer data and managing that customer data really well. And so there's a level for me, there's a bit about maturing that. Fortunately, if you look at a country like India, in terms of where they've got to from the mid-60s to where they are now, in terms of a real digital powerhouse, you know, that's the kind of model that I think Jamaica and the Caribbean should really be emulating. And there's a question in the chat earlier about, can the Caribbean afford to invest in this area? My argument would be, for a country that has these digital aspirations, can it afford not to invest in this area?
No, excellent point. And I think we we all have experienced, you know, I think when you purchase things versus when you get things for free, and when you pay more for some things that are considered premium price versus, you know, things that are not are deemed more affordable. You know, so really we can't, when you're looking at the infrastructure, the technology infrastructure of a country, you know, that's really not the conversation you need to be having. You know, it's a different level of conversation that you need to be having. And I think there is more than enough support from a private sector perspective, and even from donors or funding organizations. I think there is a lot of available support that the government can take advantage of if we have a proper strategy in place, and we have the persons or the individuals, resources, groups, objective bodies that are going to hold everyone to account, including the government. So I want to thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you to everybody that tuned in. So thanks to my panelists, Samantha, Sheree, Tracy, Richard, and Martin. Thank you all, especially to Samantha and Martin. You're tuning in at some god-awful hours in the UK. So thanks so much for burning midnight oil with us. We're really looking forward to the meat and the material that's going to come from these discussions. So please, guys, join us next week as we foray into the conversation about an educational center of excellence. Do we need a cyber academy? What should it look like? We'll be hearing from heads of UTech, UE, NCU, as well as CMU. So join us next week for that conversation, so that as we continue the discussion around cybersecurity and data privacy and what we need to be doing as a country to advance ourselves and the region at large. So take care, guys, until next week. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye everyone. Bye Stacey. Bye Richard. Bye Samantha.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks, guys.